Okay, welcome to episode 124 of an Evolving Man podcast. Today I'm excited to be speaking to Toby Ingham. Toby is a BPC and UKCP registered psychotherapist and supervisor, member of the British Psychotherapy Foundation, the Association of Independent Psychotherapists, and BAPPS. Former clinical director of St Barts Counselling. He has 25 years of experience working with people dealing with depression, low mood, anxiety states, trauma, bereavement, addictions, and emotional instability. And he is also the author of A Guilty Victim. Welcome, Toby.
Thank you very much, Piers. Nice to be here. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, thank you for agreeing to come and speak today. How I'd love to begin the, the the podcast today is just for you to share a little of your journey. How did you get into writing this book?
Well, let me see. I suppose starting with the end of your question, I was very interested to write a book that I might have liked to have read many years ago. So I didn't want to write a book that was solely for psychotherapists or for professional people. I wanted to write a guilty victim in such a way as it would be really relevant to anyone suffering from the kinds of problems that William Smith, who's the anonymized character in my book, describes and goes through in as part of the book project. I guess going back to the beginning of the question, how did I get into it? I suppose my own journey into psychotherapy followed my own interest in trying to understand how to improve emotional stability. That was has always been a big driver for me, and I think that's one of the things that I've probably learnt most about and continue to think about.
Mm, thank you. Thank you. Emotional stability.
Mm.
Maybe we'll come back to that in a bit. I would love you to just to talk a little bit about the book, you know. Kind of, can you tell me a little bit about what happens, that suddenly you're working with this person, William Smith.
Yeah.
Then was there a specific day you were like, oh, I need to write about this? What happened?
Well, I mean, I write about this a bit in the book. I suppose what happened was that when I first met William, he presented as someone, successful, in all kinds of ways, but struggling with certain feelings of low mood, and so forth. And we started off just talking to each other and having sessions, and over a period of time began to see that the areas that were troubling him might really relate to things that were much older than what he was thinking they were to do with. And so gradually, as you do in a psychotherapy relationship, we built up the trust that made it possible to explore things more. My feeling's always been that it's not that there's something wrong with us. Really, we suffer because of things that have happened to us. The problem is, I think it's very hard to hold on to a lot of the things that have happened to us. And so William and I worked together, and one of the things that he couldn't do, there was a sort of internal prohibition on, was any kind of creative project.
Mhm.
As we worked, he started to create some images. And over the course of the therapy, these images turned into this codex, I think is the word. I can show you a little bit now, which you may be able to see, but it
Wow.
formed this, yeah, this really rich timeline, which went from him right at the beginning to up to where we were. And towards the end, or about the end of the work, when we'd arrived at a much different place from where we started, and he was living in a much healthier way, he said, and happier. He said that these images should be a book, and invited me to write the text to go with them. And at first I thought, well, I don't know if that's ethical,
Mhm.
but over time and many years, I came to the view that actually that sounds to me like a rather good idea. Because one of the problems in therapy is that it's very unusual, certainly in my experience, and in fact, the books behind me would testify this. It's very unusual to have permission to tell the story of a therapy.
Mhm.
And because William had produced this illustration, the whole timeline of his life and the story of our work together, because I become a part of those pictures, I had a framework that I could use to write the book, which really helped because in a long therapy, there's so much information that it's really difficult to know how to piece things together. But now I had really, because of the drawings, exactly as he said, we had, I could use the timeline from the point of view of talking about the therapy and talking about him. And so I, that's how it began. And I originally wrote it as a novel
Mhm.
because, like I say, I didn't want it to be a book for therapists or just therapists. I've got nothing against therapists, but I wanted to write a book for everyone, really. And I thought, well, a novel might be where that would fit in. And myself, I'd always found, in my own education, that narrative was much easier for me to hold on to and remember. So I wanted something that was more narrative than a book that would be academic and constantly referencing, papers within psychoanalytic journals and so on. And so I wrote it as a novel, which took years, and nobody wanted the novel.
Mhm.
I just got rejection after rejection. And an agent said to me one day that this should be nonfiction. So I kind of gritted my teeth and decided, all right, I'll rewrite it again, but this time as closer to nonfiction. I mean, I think you still can see the novel in it. There's still large narrative episodes. I went out of my way to show rather than tell, as they say.
Mhm.
And that's really how the book developed, which is a bit of a
Mhm.
long answer to your question, isn't it? But
No, that's great. Great. That makes a lot of sense. It's interesting about that, trying to write it as a story. And I found that
yes,
writing books myself, that it's a bit like, right, you feel like you finished and then it gets rejected. And then it's like someone gives you a suggestion, well, I think you need to rewrite it. And I've had that a few times. And I'm like, oh,
yeah.
how
As,
did
as
you, how did you get over that?
Well, now I can sit here and laugh and think, how did I get over that? I don't know. At the time, it was gutting to, because, for example, I might track down an agent and think they'd be great to work with. And also I felt I could do with one because I felt I could do with someone who could help me shape the book more. Um, but you just get rejection letters. The thing that was interesting was when I did get it together and rewrote it as nonfiction, the rejection letters became warm instantly, and I knew that I was in a different place. And then, to my delight, Karnak said that they wanted to publish it, and here we are. So it's published in March now.
Right. Wow.
Mm.
Amazing. Amazing. So one of the things I would love for you maybe to go into, you talk about in the book, what happened to your client at school? And was it a boarding school? Just clarity for listeners.
Yes, it was a boarding school. It was a boarding school in Ireland.
Okay.
So what happened is that, well, I think you have to go back a little bit,
Okay.
um, because this is part of what I hope the book explores and explains. The the book looks at what happens to people who get groomed, right?
Mm,
And I think grooming is something that people are vulnerable to suffer in, be you in a football club or a ballet school or an institution or wherever you are. It's not just a boarding school phenomenon. What I think I found is certainly going on my work with William is that if we suffer certain kind of attachment problems in our early years, so if we are kind of unhappy children who've been rather rejected and neglected in our families, we have become more vulnerable. And if you send a vulnerable child to, in this case, a boarding school in Ireland, those vulnerable children get spotted by perpetrators of abuse. And I think one of the things I hope the book might contribute to is that we could think more about how you pick out vulnerable people before predators do. Because vulnerable people, anyone who, needs something can be groomed. So what happens in this story is that William is sent to a boarding school. He falls out with his friendship group and then becomes more vulnerable, at which point a predatory priest spots him and, is someone who I think he's not alive anymore, that priest, but he's someone who was probably very experienced in spotting vulnerable children and using his position to groom, and that led to abuse. That's really what happens. William then leaves the school because eventually he manages to persuade his family that he shouldn't be there anymore. But of course, when he leaves the school, I mean, he thinks he's leaving everything behind.
Yeah, yeah.
What he finds is that his life is stuck at a certain plane whereby he's someone who cannot have good things like the rest of humanity can have. In fact, I mean, these drawings describe this very well. What happens in the drawings is that following a very early trauma, sorry, because these are in the book. If anyone reads the book, they'll see them. But following an early trauma, he lives in a kind of divided world. He is in the upper tier, to use William's language, and the rest of humanity are in the lower tier. And people in the lower tier get the right attention. If they're unhappy, people pick up on that and respond appropriately. Whereas the people like William, who've been neglected and made vulnerable, don't get help other than the wrong kind. That then follows through life after school. So he's successful because he's very good at doing things for other people. So he works in sales, he does very well, but he's never doing it for himself. He's really only doing things to make his boss happy, for example. And I think when, up to the point that we met, and of course, during a lot of the work we were doing together, that was still the case. And the ongoing project was to really to see if it was possible that he didn't live in that above the line, out of humanity place, but was someone who could be engaged and satisfied and living better.
That's a fascinating diagram, that it almost feels like the split, and it's just on one kind of lens is emotional kind of secure attachments below the line,
Yeah.
Insecure above. And I
Yeah.
think in Diane Poole Heller's book about attachment, she says the children who were avoidant, insecure, often were neglected as children.
That's right.
And it's
That's right.
interesting that bland world that's kind of in the top of the picture and then in the bottom's nice and colorful. I've often heard this so many times, people talking about how these boarding schools were these bland black and white places. And then you'd go out in the 70s or the 80s and there'd be all this color on the street. And we were
Yes.
totally devoid of that.
Yes, 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 yeah. Well, that's right. That's right. That's right.
So, at what point did he, I mean, what were some of the symptoms that started to show up for him? I'm hearing, you know, he was successful on one level, but what were some of the, because I think what I often hear from boarders who say, well, I loved it, I often say to them, okay, great. Do you have any of these symptoms? And they go, yeah, I do. I have all of them. And I went, well, yes, you might have loved it, but you're still carrying the effects of what you went through. And that's kind of really what Joy Chavrian says, boarding school syndrome. It's a cluster of learned behaviors and emotional states. So I'd love you to share what William presented.
He presented low mood,
Mm,
depression, low mood. So he was taking, certain medications when we met. So low mood, um, drinking much too much,
mm,
overweight, a prohibition on anything that might be creatively satisfying for you and me. So, I know you like running.
mm,
Um, William was not allowed to do anything that would create pleasure for him. And in fact, there's a story in the book where he does go for a run and really, in the middle of enjoying it, suddenly has that realization that this isn't for him. He doesn't deserve that kind of pleasure from running. So I suppose the main symptom is that other than doing things for his wife and children, for whom he can do, he can do anything.
mm,
We met at the time that William's uh, youngest child was, I think she herself actually had gone to boarding school, but not the kind of boarding school that we're talking about from, the dark periods of the sort of 70s, 80s, and so on. But her going to this school meant there was one less person to be doing things for. And that triggered a kind of awareness that if he wasn't careful, this could be the beginning of something catastrophic. So other than being free to do things for wife and family, um, he could have no pleasure for himself. And on top of that, the drinking, bad diet. Um, I think those were probably the main issues. Very
mm,
low mood, very, very a kind of aggressive, internalized thinking voice that would be very punitive and be very quick to get on his back. And I mean, it was one of the problems of the therapy, and I hope I've described this in therapy because, most therapy breaks off prematurely. One of the things about this story is it was an opportunity to show a whole therapy, which I think I hope people find that interesting. I still find it interesting. But most of the work that a therapist might do ends prematurely, you
mm,
know. Um, and we had numerous occasions where the kind of internal negative thinking would tell William, stop seeing this idiot,
mm.
go off and drink yourself silly and let's get out of here. But somehow we built up enough therapeutic trust, therapeutic relationship to keep going.
Mm, mm, mm.
Yeah.
Why do you feel that, you know, people do end prematurely? I know Nick talks about that in Trauma, Abandonment and Privilege, this thing with borders. What do you see in your work? Why do we? Why is it
Well,
we?
I mean, I tend to think that when someone comes to see me, you never really know where the impulse to start therapy came from. So yes, someone might ring me today because they've had a thought they should ring me today. But generally speaking, when you start talking to that person, the impulse for it is older than the phone call that just got made, right? And I think that I don't think of myself as a kind of I don't know, this is going to be the conversation that fixes everything. But it might be that while we're talking, we create better emotional stability. we improve certain things, and we see what follows from that. But people will break off a therapy, I think, for, all kinds of reasons. Some of them, to do with, things change in their lives or who knows what. Some of them, it's harder to get at, but it's not uncommon that I'll meet people who they've got some interest, but if there isn't that kind of, I don't know, an unconscious hook in
Mm,
them that kind of hooks into something in me, you can't really fight that.
mm,
So I think being a therapist is often a question of trying to trying to have conversations and trying to pursue things and just trying to keep something of this impulse going when we don't really have that much control over that.
mm, mm.
Not sure if that's a good answer, but it's
That's a great answer. Yeah, it's useful. It's like that impulse, that connection. If it's not necessarily there, then that might mean that the therapy ends.
I
Uh,
mean, similarly, I'll meet people and you'll find out that 5 years ago they saw someone and it was really helpful. And you think, or oh, okay, what happened there? Oh, well, I stopped because of this and that. Oh, I see. Did you think of contacting that person again? Maybe because it sounds like it was a good relationship, and certainly they're still a good person in your head, as it were. No, I didn't think to do that. I'm aware, though, that there has been this good experience with a therapist,
mm,
and now there might be a chance to do some more with another therapist. And so I think for lots of us, it's not a question that you meet a therapist and you get to the bottom of something and you finish. I think for a lot of people, it's a kind of joining the dots over the course of a life.
yeah, 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 yeah. There's a couple of things there you've said. Um, on one of the podcasts, I spoke to a guy called Richard Grannon. We talked a bit about complex PTSD and Pete Walker's book, Complex PTSD. And he talks in there about the inner critic. And as you share about your client going running, and then he has this inner critic come in. And it reminds me of me. I started to create in my 20s. I was having a breakdown. I lived in a monastery and I was starting to paint. And I began by trying to draw and just do stuff. And the inner voice was like, this is awful, really berating me. So I began to do abstract. And then I would say to that inner critic, I'm not trying to do anything. Yes, it doesn't look like a car, but it's not meant to. And that helped me to be able to create an almost a bit like Cobra in the 1950s. It was a movement out of Copenhagen, Denmark, Belgium, where they painted like children. So I connected in with that early part, and that helped to circumnavigate that inner critic. I'd love you to talk a little bit about the inner critic. What is something, why do you feel that comes on board? And are there tools or things that you feel are really helpful, especially with your client William, to start diminishing the power of that?
I think in terms of the first question, you might have to remind me of the second bit, but in terms of the first question, I think for a variety of reasons, we internalize these critical attitudes from, maybe all kinds of situations and people in quite a piecemeal way. I mean, I think one of the extraordinary things about a lot of psychoanalytic writing is its capacity to think at quite a molecular level of the way in which something aggressive might get um, internalized and set up a kind of location, a place in the mind. And once we've got those, I think we might be people who, you know, that kind of thought, the negative critical, is always part of the landscape. I guess for me, I don't think that we can ever exactly, you can't remove something that's happened. but you can learn to live with it much better.
mm, mm,
And I suppose that I think that's my ongoing project for myself is how to continue to think and learn about what's internal and critical and difficult. Um, I mean, with William in the book, there's what you would read is that any impulse towards creativity, be that enjoying an art class at school, because art is a theme of his experience, be that exercise, there's these things can only be done if they're for other people.
mm,
Anything that is just for himself has this prohibitive um, block on it.
mm,
And that can become and does become, I think, when that voice gets going further and inevitably starts to say you really shouldn't be here, becomes coupled with alcohol, something that can be lethally disruptive. So that I think we all that's what I'd say to the starting part of your question, which is how do we come to have these kinds of voices? I think we internalize them. Was the second part? What was the second? Was it? Can we get rid of them? Was it or?
Which, yeah, just some techniques. What can we do? Because it sounds like William has learned to manage that inner critic. And I just wonder, what is that process? You know?
Well, I think in William's case, and I think this is something I'm hoping that maybe a lot of readers could relate to. William produces this timeline, which I've showed you earlier, and it's over, I think, 9 pages, and it's really quite something. But so what he does is he actually finds a way to sketch out his timeline and to understand the contextual events that have led to the kinds of problems he's wrapped up in. Like I said earlier, it's not that there's something wrong with us, it's that things have happened to us.
Mm,
So I think one technique, if you like, is to continue to work on understanding what it is that's happened to us.
mm,
Okay.
mm,
I think another is to always, how can I put this? Is to be able to keep working on this as an ongoing kind of work in progress. That is being able to approach ourselves and the parts of ourselves that are difficult and we might be tempted to reject or who knows what, retaining interest in those parts of ourselves. I think is helpful so that we might be able to say when we're having a reaction to something out of the blue, is this more to do with things that happened to me than
mm,
it is really anything to do with what's happening now? So, like if there's a problem in a relationship, when people get in relationships, sometimes they can start to experience a lot of criticism. And it's very easy to think, as in internal criticism,
mm,
and it's very easy to think the problem is the relationship. And that's not helpful. But if we can say, actually, this might relate to something that's older than me meeting my new partner, then we might get a breather and some space to think.
mm,
And another thing I guess I'd say, which is helpful, if we suffer with any of these kinds of things, in my experience, alcohol and drugs are unhelpful. Anything that, is mood altering tends to have the effect of throwing our stability around a bit.
mm,
And so I would say to anyone, drink less if
mm,
you've suffered with these kind of problems, because I think, yeah, we're trying to improve our emotional stability fundamentally.
mm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's now nearly 23 years since I gave up drinking, and it made such a difference. Remember having my first New Year's Eve without alcohol, and it was like, oh. Oh my God, this is what it's like. This is really lovely. Used to be passed out before 12 o'clock, different places around the world.
Look at
And
you now.
yeah.
You've got
Yeah.
your own podcast. Look at you. See?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. I remember one time being on Charles Bridge in Prague and I'd passed out. This was before midnight and my girlfriend was holding onto my coat so that I didn't fall into the river.
Yeah.
Yes.
You need to go back to Prague and have a nice time. Nice sober time.
Yeah, yeah, it's true. It's been many years since I've been to Prague. So,
But
yeah,
so you stopped drinking.
I did. Yeah, 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 yeah. And I found that after I stopped drinking, the inner critic became very virulent for a number of years, and the painting helped. Yeah, it was quite an unpleasant couple of years, but I think you've just mentioned that about the inner voice, the critic, and also what I found was the outer critic that Pete Walker talks about, feeling being really critical of other people. And because I was living in a community, a monastery, it
Uh-huh.
was very easy for me to put all of my baggage, project onto him,
Yes,
onto them, and
absolutely.
so the painting, but I felt a lot of anger for number of years. So the drinking, I think by stopping it allowed the emotion up and the grief came. And I think as I started to cry more, and I can't remember if it was Joy Shavrian saying that in my podcast with her, saying that once the tears go down and the grieving, certainly Pete Walker says that, it's like you let go of the grief and then the inner critic also starts to diminish. And that's what I found.
Well, I was thinking about what you said about projecting,
Mhm.
because I think that's a very interesting thing. If one side of the coin is the way we, internalize aggression towards ourselves, I think yes, it can surprise us to realize just how much we're projecting something like that out into the world as well. And when we, manage to stop doing the projecting and stop, notice what we're doing internally, yeah, I mean, I think you can turn the volume down on these things significantly quite quickly. But I do think that, you have to be careful about around alcohol and drugs.
Yeah, 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 yeah. I found them so destructive,
Mm.
alcohol and drugs. I think
Yes,
it was more the self-loathing that I would feel in that state. I mean, I did a lot of poetry when I was drunk, reams of books, but yeah, I got very depressed. It wasn't an uplifting like exercises or spending time with friends. It was more of a depressant. Um,
sure. A very repetitive depressant.
yeah, 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 yeah. So you've also mentioned there a couple of times this idea of emotional stability. Do you
Yes.
want to go into more depth and expand on that? What is it, and how do we cultivate emotional stability?
Well, along the way of struggling to get a guilty victim published, I wrote a couple of short books on Amazon, and one of them was on um, emotional stability. And I think that, we can get attached to complicated ideas about diagnosis. Okay. And we do live in a time where, people are being given diagnoses and they're being given medication. It's not hard to get onto a pathway whereby you're someone with a diagnosis, with a prescription history, etc. Um, but I have a feeling that a lot of these things can be, how can I put it, sort of translated back into ordinary human experience. And the way I've thought about that is just about emotional stability. Okay. Um, so really, how can I think to answer this question? Um, in terms of how to, what are we asking? How do we improve it? Or
Yeah, yeah. So one is, you've mentioned what it is, but how do we improve this emotional stability if it's important to us,
I,
because
I think, yeah,
I feel, my experience of boarding school, having spoken to 120 people, is that emotions are not considered important. Nick, in his book Wounded Leaders, says, the principal problem with boarding school is a problem with emotion.
yeah,
And so naturally, I don't feel we have emotional stability. We have emotional disconnection or disassociation.
yes.
So some people might not know where to start.
Well, I think that you're right, that our relationship with emotion, it isn't something that we're educated in particularly. I mean, that may have improved somewhat, but certainly of my generation, it certainly wasn't the case at all. Um, you were educated in science and history or something, but you weren't really introduced to yourself and how you relate to people and the kind of impact you have. I think, really becoming interested to notice more of the ways in which our own emotional stability is disturbed I think it's a helpful thing to just try and start noticing it. I think it's helpful to limit things that are, if we notice that alcohol or drugs has a negative effect on our emotional stability, if we can just try to cut out the alcohol and drugs, so reducing the things that, send us for a spin, we tend to help ourselves more just like that. And I think it's finding ways to help ourselves navigate our problems in a way that doesn't just repeat the problem,
Mm.
but actually does something to give us a bit more of a steady base. I think it's a really good project. Then we can think about, well, when did this start? When did this history of emotional stability come in, instability, stability come in? Did I grow up in a home that had stability around it? Or was my home, a home which suffered trauma, bereavement, um, whatever it might be? And, as a child, you can somehow grow up absorbing these things and making a very good job of looking like everything's fine and dandy. But down the line, it tends to not work out like that. And so, again, as I said earlier, it's not that there's something wrong with us that means we struggle to have emotional stability. I think it's generally that these are things that we've acquired. It's
Mm.
just that we lose sight of what it was that put us on that pathway. And that's why, William drawing his timeline um, was such an illustrative piece of information.
Mm. Yeah, I love that. That idea of, when did this start? This emotional instability starting to
Yes.
explore. Would you say something like journaling or, just talking to a therapist? What do you find is just
Well,
exploring within yourself?
Well, whenever I meet someone for the first time, when I carry out an assessment kind of conversation, I always draw out the family tree. I'll always say, okay, how old are you? And then I'll ask about whether are there siblings and are you married and your siblings and what are the age differences and your parents, are they still together? And I draw all this out. And generally, by the time you've finished drawing that out, you've learned so much. So someone who doesn't get on with their siblings or something, or there's a big gap in age between one couple of siblings here and one there, or whatever it might be. And you find yourself thinking, well, that's interesting, isn't there? I wonder why there's an 8-year gap. In fact, that's part of the Williams story. But I wonder why there's an 8-year gap between when your parents had, your older brother and then you.
Mm.
And, parents are different when children come along. They become more experienced, or they've suffered different kinds of things, or who knows what. So, as part of the way I understand people I meet, I'm always trying to work out what the history is.
Mm.
And I think a very simple thing we could do, and journaling, yes, but I think we could all draw out our timeline like William does,
Oh.
and just say, well, you know, for example, our lives tend to cut up around, you know, when you went to primary school, when you went to secondary school, when you first started dating. Um, there's generally patterns emerge
Mm.
just by looking at those periods of time,
Mm. Mm.
which tend to
Yeah.
be very interesting and revealing. And I think the more we know about what happened to us, the more we might have a chance of getting or improving that stability I'm talking about.
Mm. That's great. I like that timeline idea. That's
Hmm.
yeah. I've
The timeline, just to remind us of the timeline in
yeah.
question.
For
The
those
glorious.
who are listening, so in front he's got a timeline with the I guess the more black and white on the top, and then underneath is more colourful
Yeah, that's right.
experiences and just there's drawings and pictures about
Yeah.
this.
And then,
Yeah.
and that became a way of marking out the coordinates, really.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Because
yeah.
if you don't know what those are, I think you can sort of navigate badly, right?
Mm,
But if you know that you started off this way, this happened, I think you can give yourself a bit of a fighting chance here.
yeah, yeah. So if we were to look at more of a meta-analysis, patterns emerging from the work around borders, what are the general patterns that you've seen?
Well, I didn't get into this to specifically focus on boarding school
Mm,
syndrome or boarding school pupils. I think you see what I've seen with people I've met from boarding schools. I think there's quite a difference between perhaps people who've been to boarding school who, they went since 2000 to people who went to boarding schools, 60s, 70s, 80s. I think the problems that people have with attachment, the problems people have had understanding what happened to them, the experience of suddenly finding yourself, your parents have gone, you're in this environment. There hasn't really been a good explanation. There hasn't been a good um, any kind of help across the transition
mm,
from I live at home now to now I only live at home part of the time. I think a lot of people can find themselves suddenly living in a boarding school without really understanding quite what happened or how they got there. There's very little in pastoral care, certainly, if you go back a bit to this kind of boarding school syndromes you're talking about, where there wasn't any pastoral care. And the people who were teaching had no interest in pastoral care, um, and were not people who'd been vetted in any way. Now you'd like to think that the profession of education is a different place, isn't it? And that people are better connected with, you know, phones or email or whatever there might be. But I think that problem of not knowing what happened and how I got here, how I can't come home, having to live with a problem 24/7 at boarding school is,
mm,
it's not like being a day boy, is it? You can't go home from a problem at a boarding school. It's just there. And of course, things like dormitories are after, at night are a complicated, it's frightening to think really of just how young children um, really manage to handle that, particularly when things are going wrong and toxic personalities, be it bullying within your peer group, or be it abuse from someone who's meant to be looking after you. I think all of these things, though, leave their scars, and we come out of the school, go into the world, And as I say, a lot of the people I would meet would tend to not think that the problems they present to me with are anything to do with what happened when they were 7 to 18.
Mm,
And it can take a bit of patient consideration to find a way to think that they might be.
yeah, fascinating. I was just doing some analysis again because I put videos. People sometimes get back to me and say, "Oh, it was great," and what about all the people who had great times? And there's a few things I kind of go back to. Is one, if you do a Google search for boarding school, this was 6 months ago. I've not looked recently.
Yeah,
99 responses, searches, which say they're amazing. Go to this school. This is why they're great. There's just one which talks about boarding school syndrome. So by us putting this information out there is to go, well, actually, there's also a different story out there. The other
mm,
thing I was thinking about recently is about residents. You know, in order for us to be resident in the UK, we have to be here for a certain amount of time. If we're not considered a UK resident. And I think it used to be 90 days, but I think now it changes. But what I was trying to get into is that we weren't resident at home. If we were considered a UK citizen, we wouldn't be considered a UK citizen if we went to boarding school. And it's just that process of, oh, people say, well, you get to have both. It's like, no, you don't. You wouldn't be considered a resident of this country.
yeah.
Be an expat.
So that idea that you've got there could be something that someone can use as a kind of lens to think about the way they were dislocated when they were going through education, and might possibly say something about the way they kind of dislocate themselves when they try and have relationships or try and settle down or try and live a constructive life.
Yeah, yeah.
So that
Simon.
they can't take up residence in a constructive version of themselves.
Yeah, Simon Partridge has brought this to my attention about dislocation in some of
Right.
his papers. And it does seem like that there's that split. And again, drawing upon Joy's book, she says children are effectively homeless, no longer fully belonging at home nor at school. So it's that dislocation. We don't, and when we have that, it's almost like we transfer that to adult. I no longer belong at work and I don't belong at home either.
Yeah. And I think that that's true. So there's a disruption has happened, hasn't it?
Mm,
You know,
mm,
it's
mm.
happened right through you. It's happened at a psychological level. And of course, in time, you move back to where the family were or whatever happens. But you have gone through that dislocation.
Mm.
As for the people who, for whom, let's say, it's the best days of our lives, I guess that's true. I don't seem to meet that many of those people, but um, I guess there were people who maybe were better set up for the experience, who didn't stand out as kind of people that would be picked out as vulnerable or victims or targets. I mean, I think there's all kinds of chance and luck. I mean, one of the things that happens in William's story is that, and this rather fits with what's been talked about with the whole John Smythe case,
Mm.
is the priest that ends up at his school in Ireland has been moved from a different Catholic institution somewhere else. Now, one can speculate he was moved because it was time to move him on,
Mm.
i.e., that people already knew that there was something, wrong about this person. And it's this way in which people let things get covered up that has to stop.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. In our documentary, Alex Renton, he says we are a nation addicted to cover up. And he says,
Right.
do I think that children are safe nowadays? No, because we are a nation addicted to cover up. Look what's happened with the grooming scandal, or just in this last year, we've got post office grooming scandal, blood scandal, Church of England, and how many more are coming to the surface. And therefore, and I speak about this a lot in my videos, is that the duty of care is always to the institution. It's not to the child. It's not to the
Absolutely.
the the person. It's like, is this going to harm the reputation? It is. Well, let's push it under the carpet,
Mm,
you know?
mm.
So yeah, yeah, I think it's fascinating.
I mean, that's an
So
interesting thing to think. Sorry, just thinking about the covering up, because I suppose there's a way in which we're always doing that to ourselves, aren't we?
yeah.
We have a tendency perhaps to cover things up, and that's why I think developing this attitude of being able to look at the facts, draw out the timeline, look after ourselves better, not drink, not take drugs, that kind of thing. These things tend to help us steady the ship. So I was
Mm,
just thinking, saying covering up is something to be, to be obviously something to be careful of.
yeah. And I think if we come back to what we said at the beginning of the conversation, this idea of projection halfway through
Yes.
is like, well, if I've learned to cover up my emotions as a child, when I get to adulthood, then I will cover up and I'll project that out. Oh no, you can't speak about that. You've got to cover up because that's what we're doing inside ourselves. We're covering up all the time. Oh, I feel this. No, squash it down. Oh, this go. No.
Well, I mean, I think you touch on some really interesting things here about lying and truth,
Mm.
as fascinating. But what I hope, the book, A Guilty Victim, um, illustrates is a capacity to become clearer, um, to recognize the things that have happened to us, to recognize how they still relate to bad habits, to destructive things that we're still caught up in, and so give us the chance to work on changing that on an ongoing basis.
Mm, mm, great.
Mm.
So if we come back to that, the book, what has been your great learning from writing it and rewriting it?
At this point in time, I've got all my attention focused on just it, getting to March the 13th, at which point, it goes from being something that I've kind of just had to keep in my head. Um, and it's also been in William's head, but it's been in my head. And March the 13th is just this moment where finally, with a bit of luck, with a bit of wind in the sails, I'll be able to test out the hypotheses that I'm describing. Hypotheses I'm describing. Um, so at the moment, everything is just focused on the miraculousness of getting to that point, because over the 5, 6 years that it's been written, um, you know, everywhere I've gone, I've had the laptop with me rewriting the book, and now that doesn't. I'm in a different place now, but the fact that it's going to be out in the world, that it's on listed now on on Waterstones and Karnak and so on, is and we're having a conversation about it,
Mm.
is miraculous, frankly.
Mm.
That's all I can say.
Well, bless you for writing it. I think it's a really important story to share that therapeutic journey to go, oh yeah, and making it into a story. I liked reading it, that perspective of, especially when you're talking about William's drinking, drinking during the day, and just I hear so many of us struggle and have struggled with that, whether it's childhood trauma or boarding school. We just think it's normal, and actually to read it, it was like, yeah, I mean, I think I spent a year basically binge drinking and got really sick. And it was like, oh, better stop. And fortunately, I got to a monastery where there was no alcohol available. And it was
Right.
such a blessing because I'd had enough and I didn't miss it. Yeah, I had my ways of not going back to it. One was just to remember the things I'd done and the states I'd been in. It was like easy to just go back. Actually, no, I don't want to go back there.
Well,
And,
I'm really, really, pleased that you liked it, because obviously,
mm,
you write something and you dream that somene's going to say they liked reading it, and so
mm,
that's, wonderful to hear. I hope other
mm.
people have
Uh,
a response like that.
I'm sure they will. I'm sure they will. Any last thoughts as we start wrapping this up, kind of about either the book or anything you would like to share with my audience?
I mean, look, there's so many things we've touched on we could take further, but maybe we can in the future we can find another time to. But
Yeah.
I can't think of quite what I've said today. But it's been, great to have this conversation with you.
Yeah, it's been fascinating. I think that's what I see. My wife really loves listening to Joe Rogan or some of these other long form podcasts.
Mm.
And what happens is new ideas are drawn through. It's like I've not talked about the idea of residence before, but it's just an idea that's come. It's like, wait a minute, you'd be considered. So that's what I've loved about today is like, oh, drawing forward new ideas from both of us, and hopefully our listeners um, will find it helpful. But yeah, my invitation, guys, is please go and buy Toby's book, 13th of March. I'll put a link in the description. And
Excellent.
yeah, please as well, please read it and write a review. That's really important on places like Amazon and Karnak.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, anything if that people could do to help spread the word, fabulous.
Yeah, great, great. Well, real pleasure speaking to you. Thank you, Toby.
Thank you, Piers.
Okay, bye bye.